Hello everyone and welcome to another Top Tips for Archaeology graduates, and today we're joined by Stephen. Stephen, how are you today?
Good, thank you.
So Stephen works in law, he is a barrister, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a barrister and what are some of the things that he does on his day-to-day job.
Yeah, so being a barrister is, as you say, is a lawyer, but there's different types of lawyers in England and Wales. So you can either be a solicitor or a barrister. Solicitors tend to do the work, which is case preparation, corresponding with other parties, taking instructions from the client, etc., etc. Whereas what I do is I provide specific advice, so either in writing or talking to somebody in person or over the phone. And I provide the main part of the job is advocacy services. So I'm the person who actually goes to court and stands up on behalf of the client and speaks to the judge or to the jury if it was in a criminal case about the particulars of the case. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can be a barrister, and there's lots of different areas of law that you can practice in. So the main ones that you might hear about are criminal barristers, and they're the ones that you'll see drawn on the news, wearing a wig and gown and all that sort of stuff. I used to be a criminal barrister. I don't practice in crime anymore. I now practice an area of family law. So that is basically anything to do with children. So part of the job is where people are arguing over their own children, who should have the child live with them, who should spend time with the child, etc., etc. That's relatively straightforward. The other part of the job, the main part of the job that I do, and the specialism that I now have, is where parents have failed to care for the children properly, such that the state has had to intervene to remove children from the care of a parent and potentially place them somewhere else or for adoption or whatever. So the work that I do is largely around children who have suffered significant harm, whether that's through physical abuse or sexual abuse or emotional harm. And my main job is to represent either local authorities, parents, or the children themselves in that process to find out what's happened and what we should do about it. So it's quite an unusual area of law, and it's not one that people know much about because all of the proceedings are conducted in private and not publicised, because obviously it relates to sometimes very confidential information about a child. So it's a very poorly understood area of law, but actually quite an important area of law, and it obviously deals with a lot of child protection issues. So yeah, that's the basics. Yeah.
That must be quite challenging, I imagine. Are there aspects of your role that you find quite challenging?
Yeah, I mean, there are days where you just sort of read it and think, my God, this is awful. You know, there really are bad things that people do to their children. And again, it's not a thing that many people sort of know about. You see big high profile cases. Some people might remember the baby Peter case with the chronic neglect and physical abuse of that child that led to his eventual death. And that is a very extreme example of the sort of work that I do day in, day out. And that obviously comes with a certain emotional baggage as well, because you know it is hard to read about child sexual abuse over a number of years, day in, day out, and deal with those cases regularly. But you do develop a sort of professional, not hardness, but you do develop a professional way of coping with that. You know, once you know that these things happen, you sort of come to terms with it. And actually you see your role within the process as being, that's my job, that I do my bit, other people do their bit, and the whole system works quite well. So yeah, it can be challenging and it's hard work, you know, I mean, it really is. You know, a lot of what I do involves huge amounts of information that has to be assimilated, processed, and then regurgitated in a sort of more understandable way. For example, I've just finished a trial that took a month of court time. And in that trial, it was a number of people who were accused of sexually abusing a child. And we had all of their mobile phones had been seized by the police and analysed. The upshot of which was that I, who was acting for the local authority, was given 40,000 pages of mobile phone data, raw mobile phone data. So just a text message from this number to that number. And you have to really be able to assimilate that amount of information into something which you can then present to a court and tell the story of what's actually going on. And that can be a very time consuming and very challenging process. But it's fun.
Yeah,
it's fun.
Yeah. It must be very rewarding as well. Like, you're working on serious cases, but the other side of that is that you are making a real difference. What are some of the things that you kind of enjoy about your job? Is it that sense that you're making a difference?
Partly it's making a difference, and that is definitely, there's a real sense of satisfaction when you know you've done your job well, and you think, well, actually, another barrister might not have done it as well as that. They wouldn't have got that outcome. That's very rewarding. It's also, that's quite pressurizing, because you put pressure on yourself in those circumstances. But I think the main thing that I would say is the true joy of being a barrister is that you are self-employed. You entirely plough your own furrows. So you are only as good as the work that people want to send to you. There's a huge amount of variety that comes from it. And every day some new challenge happens, which you develop your skills from. You learn something from it. And I can honestly say I've been doing this now for over 15 years, and I've never been bored for a single day at work. And I don't think many people can say that, to be honest. I don't think there's many people that can honestly say that every day they go to work and they enjoy it. And I do. So I consider myself very, very, very fortunate to do the job that I do.
That's great, thank you. So can I change tack a little bit now and ask you how you went from archaeology, studying archaeology, into working as a barrister?
Yeah, sure. So I did my undergraduate degree between 2000 and 2003, and I loved archaeology. I just thought it was fascinating. I really, really enjoyed it, such that I wanted to go back to do my master's, and I wanted to go on and do a PhD in it. And at the time, working in archaeology, there weren't really that many full-time jobs going. There was a lot of contract work with units, but there wasn't a lot of full-time work going. And I remember it was probably a few months after I graduated, I was sat in the pub with my friend, and he had to buy me a pint because I didn't have any money at all. I couldn't even afford to buy a pint. And he said, you're a really argumentative bloke, you're really intelligent, why don't you go and become a barrister? And I said, what's that? And he explained to me, I didn't come from a law background at all. Nobody in my family was a lawyer. I knew nothing about it. And of course, I came from Scotland. So even then, there's a different system in Scots law. So I knew nothing about law in England at all. And he sort of explained a little bit about it. And I thought, yeah, that sounds quite fun. So I went and wrote to every solicitor's firm in the city of York and said, could I come and do some free work experience, please? One of them got back to me, who was a lovely woman whose office was based just next to the Magistrates' Court in York. And I went and did 2 weeks work experience with her in criminal law and just loved it. It was the first day that I went into the Crown Court and watched barristers standing up and arguing cases in front of a jury. I just thought, yes, this is the job for me. This is what I want to do. So after that, I then did some paid work experience with her, worked for a few other legal firms in different areas of law, just in sort of paralegal temp sort of roles, but just really getting some sort of experience of how the law worked. And then I had to go into the transition from archaeology degree through to legal qualification. So that involves a 1-year conversion degree, which I did at York. It was then College of Law. It's now the University of Law. I think they still have a campus in York, but I'm not sure. And then I did a year of bar school in London. So that was to qualify as a barrister. Then you have to undertake pupillage, which is when you're actually trained by another barrister to become a barrister. And at the end of that process, which was 3 years in total, so 1 year conversion course, 1 year bar school, 1 year pupillage. At the end of that, I was a fully qualified barrister practicing under my own certificate and doing things my own way. And I have to say that at each stage of that, there was a significant financial commitment. So the conversion course as a postgraduate course was expensive. The year in London training to be a barrister was expensive. Obviously when you are a trainee barrister as a pupil, you're being paid for the work that you do, but it's an absolute pittance, to be honest. So I would say that by the time I actually qualified, and bearing in mind that was 15 years ago, I had over £40,000 worth of student debt. And I was in the fortunate position that I didn't have to pay for my undergraduate studies. So that was purely postgraduate stuff. And I didn't come from a wealthy background. I didn't have parents that were paying for that. I took loans out to cover that. And it feels hugely daunting when you're taking out £40,000 of unsecured borrowing. You think, oh my God. But actually, once you get into a profession and once you're successful in that, really that money can be paid off quite quickly. And it's a risk worth taking if you think you're going to make it. If you think you're good enough to do it, then don't be put off by the potential financial burdens, would be my view.
I think that's important to hear, because often we hear sort of the student loans up front. We don't see that process further down the line, and it is heart stopping. Like you, I was very lucky to go through a time when there weren't big fees. Yeah. And we know students today are facing those big decisions, and so it's useful, I think, for our graduates to hear what it's like from someone who's been through that. Can I ask, so you didn't study law for your undergraduate degree, you did archaeology with us. Do you think studying archaeology has helped you as a barrister? What kind of skills did the degree give you that you still draw on today?
Absolutely. I think that because quite a lot of lawyers actually come now from a non-straight law background, and I think it adds something, because academic lawyers who did a law LLB undergraduate, they tend to be quite academic in their focus when it comes to law. And actually the law is very much an applied subject. It's how it applies in the real world. And I actually think it really helps make you a more rounded person to do a more generalised undergraduate degree and then specialise in whatever it is that you want to go into at the end of that. And I think archaeology is a really good example of that sort of generalist degree. I remember being taught by people who ranged from being absolute out-and-out Marxists to people who were very conservative in their views, and all of that was really the philosophy of archaeology rather than the nuts and bolts of it. And that gives you a really good worldview, I think. Lots of different perspectives on the past give you a really good way of looking at the present, So, but specifically from my experience of an undergraduate degree going into law, the main thing that I think I took from it was that the process of archaeology is about taking lots of little pieces of evidence and then tying that together into a story that makes sense to whether it's the wider public or a specific audience or whoever. That's what I do every single day. It's looking at the 40,000 pages of police disclosure, which might be the equivalent of 60 bags of fines that you've got sitting there. And actually it's about being able to say, well, that's diagnostic. The rest of it we can ignore. But from these diagnostic pieces, we can then put together a story. So, in many ways, what I do now is exactly the same as what I did as an undergraduate archaeologist. It's just that I do it in a very different context. So really, the evaluation of evidence and the interpretation of evidence and telling a story from that is very much a transferable skill. The other thing I think which I really benefited from the archaeology undergraduate degree was one has to put oneself in the mind of somebody else. So if you're imagining the past, you are by definition imagining the past. You can't speak to that person. You can't know what was going on in their head. All you can do is try to empathise with them and to imagine what their life must have been like. Well, I do that every single day because a lot of the parents that I represent have had the most appalling life experiences, ones that I happily could never imagine. But the ability to say, right, from the information I've got, what must that person's day-to-day existence be like, is actually something that I think I learned thinking about real individuals in the past when I was reading archaeology. So I think that there really are a lot of skills that transfer very directly from my undergraduate degree to what I do now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I loved what you had to say about, sorting evidence out and picking out what's diagnostic. Like a lot of people use that in their careers, and I think archaeology gives you a really interesting way of thinking about evidence, because we're not just looking at one type of evidence. It's everything that we include. Equally,
it's also like, imagine if you went into medicine after an archaeology degree, you converted to that. It's exactly the same thing. A patient may come in and tell you 500 things about what's going on, but you as the doctor need to know which of those is relevant and diagnostic. Exactly the same process. I suspect most professionals probably go through quite similar processes of filtering And I found that archaeology taught me how to do that quite well.
So can I end by asking what your top tips are for any of the graduates listening to this who want to go on and work in law or as a barrister?
Yeah, certainly. Actually, perhaps just before, I've just thought of another point about archaeology, which was probably quite relevant to what I do now. And that was, I did the BA undergraduate degree, and basically that was not that much teaching and a lot of research. It was a lot of time just spent on my own in libraries reading things and learning about a subject. And I think that independence of practice and independence of thought is a really important aspect of any profession that you go into as a postgraduate. And some degree courses with a much higher sort of top content, I think, can be a little bit like an extension of high school. And it's a little bit sort of, here's what you need to know, remember this. Whereas I found that as an undergraduate doing the BA degree, I really learned how to think critically and to go and research and to think about things on my own. And that, I think, held me in very good stead when I went into the wider world as an adult and also just into work specifically. But anyway, yeah, sorry, coming back to top tips. Yeah, top tips. It's quite tricky because it will depend on what you want to do and where you want to get to. And if, for example, somebody wanted to work in a top commercial law firm in London, the ways of going about that would be very different to being in a legal aid practice in York or in a Midlands chambers like I'm in or whatever. But I think, broadly speaking, the best thing you can do is do your research thoroughly, think about what you want to achieve, and target the research that you do to the areas that you want to get into. And work experience is absolutely fundamental, completely crucial. So what I did was I worked in lots of different areas of law to get a little taster of what that was like, and decided the bits that I enjoyed and the bits that I didn't. The bits that I didn't want to go into, I just parked them and said, right, I'm not interested in commercial litigation. I don't want to argue about contracts for multinational companies. I'm not interested in a neighbour that's fallen out with their other neighbour and they're in dispute over land. I'm not bothered about that. I want to be in court and I want to be arguing things. So that for me meant criminal law and family law. So I did lots and lots of work experience around those areas of law that I wanted to do, and always tried to beef up my CV, essentially. You know, everything that I did, I thought, is this worthwhile? Is this adding anything to my experience? Does this make me look better to a prospective employer? So I think really just focusing on what you need to do. And, you know, no one has a lot of time these days. People will be working part-time, I imagine, to pay for studies. People will have their undergraduate degree to do. They'll probably be going on to postgraduate work as well. You don't have enough time to just say, I'll do everything. So you've got to be really focused and research where you want to go and how you want to achieve that. And the other thing I would say is that, so within my chambers, which is the organisation of barristers that I work for, I now recruit and train pupil barristers, so trainee barristers. And the real important thing is to be able to make yourself stand out, because there are so many high quality applicants with good A levels and good degrees from good universities that it's very hard sometimes to sort the wheat from the chaff. And I think the more you can do on a CV that looks interesting, the more likely you are to get in and actually have an interview. And it's once you get in the door, it's up to you. That's when you can come across well or badly. But the paper stage is always the unfair part, because lots of good applicants don't make it past the paper stage just because they're the same as 30 other good applicants. So I think do things that will make you stand out. Having a degree in archaeology will actually make you stand out already to an extent, because it's the sort of thing that people might think, oh, that's interesting. That's different to, you know, English Lit or, you know, PP or whatever else people have read. But just try to have something that's interesting and engaging that makes people take notice of your application is, I think, quite good, a good tip to have.
Some excellent advice there, and I think that your points about archaeology and independent research, and then doing your research for your career, is a really neat point, in that you learn how to research to do archaeology, and you need to apply some of those skills to thinking about your career and what you do after you graduate. Thank you, Stephen, so much for that really fascinating insight into working as a barrister. Thank you to everyone for watching. Join us again next time for more top tips for archaeology graduates.